Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Rich Sloma, and today's presentation here at the New York State Archives is the basics of records management. Today's presenters are Maria McCashion and Karen Rabatin. The session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. I just want to introduce Maria. She is the Records Advisory Officer, or RAO, for cities, fire districts, and New York City municipal agencies, as well as the interim RAO for villages and Cornell Cooperative Extensions. Karen is a member of our Scheduling and State Agency Services Unit. Again, this session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. If you have any questions, we ask that you please type them in the chat box to the right side of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. And at this point in time, I will turn it over. Maria has the presentation. Maria, you're all set.
Thank you, Rich. Thanks for the introduction. Welcome everyone to the basics of records management. Here with Karen today, and let's take a look at our agenda. So today, Karen and I are going to discuss why records management is important. Most of you out there listening are state agencies or from local governments or New York City mayoral agencies. And you're all required to have a program for managing government records. And all of the public officials that you work with are required to participate and support a program. So understanding why all of this is necessary and why records management is important and sharing it with others can encourage cooperation and support for a program. We're also going to talk about some best practices for managing records and key activities to include in a program. And we'll talk about some initial steps for implementing those. And we'll end with time for questions. As Rich mentioned, if you have any questions, type them in the chat box. We'll take them at the end. First, though, Karen is going to get us all started with some key terms that everyone managing records should know and understand.
Thanks, Maria. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Let's begin by defining a record. A record is recorded information in any format or media created or received as part of your work. This is a very basic definition. A more detailed definition can be found under the Arts and Cultural Affairs Law. Types of records described in the law include papers, maps, memos, reports, photographs, or emails. And these types of records may be found in a variety of formats, such as paper, digital, audio, video, film, or microfilm. Some specific examples of records may be personnel files, invoices and other general accounting documents, travel authorizations and expense reports, board meeting minutes, business-related correspondence. Keeping in mind that format or media is irrelevant when defining a record. Now, records, however, do not include certain materials, and these types of materials are considered non-records. How do we define a non-record? Well, a non-record is material not considered to fall within the definition of an official record copy, or it may be a duplicate or a publication that is kept for purposes of personal reference or convenience material. Important note, non-records may be destroyed without authorization. And some examples of non-records include library materials such as books and journals, extra copies kept only for convenience or reference, certain emails such as spam and general listserv messages, personal notes, electronic versions of documents, transactions, or reports when the record is retained on paper or microfilm. What is a record series? A record series is a group of records of like function that are normally filed together as a unit. The record series are maintained as a unit for a number of reasons. They relate to a particular subject, they result from the same activity, they have the same form, or they are related to each other in some other way. Simply, they are records that belong together. A few examples of a record series are contracts, equipment maintenance and repair records, official student transcripts for a school district, client case files, and vouchers. Now let's define records management. Records management is the systematic control of all records throughout their life cycle. That is from the record creation to disposition or permanent retention. We'll review the record's life cycle on an upcoming slide in just a moment. The Records Management Officer, or RMO, is a professional who oversees a program that manages the records and often information assets of an organization. As RMOs, you may not work in that position full-time or be formally trained records managers, but you have similar responsibilities. RMO responsibilities may include to identify and assess their organization's records, ensure that staff can easily access documents when needed, also to ensure that records are kept for as long as necessary to support business needs, and legally dispose of records when they no longer need to be retained. Both New York State local governments and state agencies are required by law to appoint an RMO and inform the state archives who that person is. All records have a lifespan, and a record's lifespan is determined by how long its information needs to be retained. This diagram illustrates the record's life cycle. The record's life cycle is a theory that records managers use to manage records at different points during their existence or lifespan and develop related policies and procedures. Let's take a look at the first life cycle phase, which is creation receipt. This occurs when a record is created within your organization or received in the course of business. In this phase, an organization has a responsibility to create or receive records in the best format that completely and accurately documents its business activities and decisions. Once a record is complete, the information should be captured as an official record. The official record copy can be in any format, and the most popular formats are paper or electronic. Next, the creation phase is the best time to identify a record. Give it a meaningful label, one that identifies the record and its retention period, and file it for easy access and known retention. The next phase is active records. This phase is when a record is used the most and is usually kept nearby in the office or on a computer. If a record has been identified and filed in a meaningful way, you will be able to find it quickly when it's needed. The next phase is inactive records, and this phase is when a record is used less often, where immediate access isn't required, although the record still needs to be managed and appropriately stored in order to meet its minimum retention requirements. Records to be retained permanently need to be evaluated for preservation needs. The next phase is final disposition. This is the final phase when a record has either met its retention requirements and can be destroyed, or is a permanent record and must be preserved and monitored in storage to ensure it remains permanently accessible. Records are often described as active or inactive. An integral part of records management is having a strategic plan for moving active records to inactive storage based on the activity surrounding the record. Highly active files need to be closer to the users in their office or their work areas. And since office space is usually at a premium, only maintain the records you need to access frequently in the office. When the records are used less often and not regularly needed to conduct business, they may be taking up valuable space needed for records newly created or received. This is just one reason why it's important to have a policy that defines when records become inactive. Keep in mind that inactive records may still need to be retained for legal or other reasons for the remainder of their assigned retention period, or in some cases retained permanently. This means your inactive records must continue to be managed, able to be accessed efficiently, and stored economically yet appropriately. Inactive record storage is only a component of a records management program.
Okay, so now let's talk about why records management is essential and important. And we'll go over all these 4 points on the next slides. But overall, records management is good risk management for your government because it ensures compliance and it protects a valuable asset, which is the records that you and your government need to function. And it promotes accountability and it can save your organization time and money. Cost effective, efficient government is what everybody wants. So the only way to show that your government is compliant with state and federal laws and your own internal policies is with records. So you want to have those records available so that you can use them as evidence to show compliance. And you do that with a good records management program, organizing the records, putting them in a safe environment, a secure environment that's built around the use of retention and disposition schedules. That will show compliance with the Arts and Cultural Affairs Law and the regulation of the Commissioner of Education. So that law and those regulations are what define most of the records management requirements for local governments, state agencies, New York City mayoral agencies. And they require having a program, appointing a records management officer, and adopting retention schedules for government records. In addition to those, there are federal laws that impact how records are managed. And some examples on the slide include FERPA, which is the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, which has requirements for protecting student records, and FOIL, which a lot of you are familiar with, the Freedom of Information Law, which has requirements for making records available to the public in a timely manner. HIPAA, which is the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act, that has protections for medical records. And hopefully you won't need this one, but the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, which has rules for preparing records involved in legal actions. As I mentioned, governments also have their own internal policies, and records need to be available to show evidence that you're following those. So a good program is going to identify your records so that you can find them when you need them and you know what you have in order to apply and fulfill related legal requirements and ensure compliance. Records management is essential because of the importance and value of records. Karen mentioned that when talking about the life cycle. And I think everyone everyone out there listening would agree that it would be difficult to do our jobs without records. And if you lost a record, it could affect key functions like tax collection or contract agreements or any type of regular government business. The state archives and the Department of Records and Information Services, or DORIS, in New York City, they work to develop retention and disposition schedules for local governments, state agencies, and New York City mayoral agencies. And in doing so, they research the importance and value of records to assign those retention requirements. For example, records with administrative value to support good decision making, planning, and to help you do your job effectively. So essentially to administer government. And then records with fiscal value to support fiscal activities like hiring and paying vendors, revenue collection, state comptrollers requirements, things like that. And the legal value of records, such as statutes of limitations on contracts and other agreements. And then finally, historical value, which may be assigned as permanent retention in a retention schedule, or it may need to be appraised to determine a record's value to an organization or to the public for historical or other research purposes. Good records management is going to promote government accountability. And a records program set up around retention and disposition of records will help do that. These points on the slide all highlight the legislative intent behind the Arts and Cultural Affairs Law with regard to records management. So the legislature agreed that records are important and needed to document government business and to allow the public to question what we're doing. Records are also needed to preserve citizens' rights. So as with property records or birth records or our own payroll and retirement records. They also create institutional memory. So for example, your board minutes and other long-term records. These allow people to review past decisions so you can see what worked or didn't work over time, and then you can use that information to plan going forward. A good records management program is going to identify your organization's essential records, so those that are critical for business. And once they're identified, then you can protect those records to ensure that they're available when you need them by storing them in the best locations, by backing them up, and by making them part of a disaster plan. And then finally, records preserve the history of your government, and they document the history of your government and the community that you're serving. They can also save time and money. So retaining and disposing of records consistently is cost effective and it promotes efficiency. And it does this by making records easier to find. And when they're easy to find, you find them quickly, and that time saved finding the records is money saved. It can help make them easier to identify for disposal. And then you've got less to search through. And also, if you've got less records, they're easier to manage. And that can save you money by reducing the need to buy more storage equipment, all those filing cabinets and shelving, or less server space for your electronic records. And good records management supports good public service, makes you look good in the public eye by enabling quick access to requested records.
In records management, these are key program elements to focus on: retention, storage, access, disposition, and preservation. We'll talk about each on the next slides. Your records management program should be built around records retention and disposition. In New York, every type of local government is required by law to adopt a retention schedule created by the state archives. The most recent edition of the retention and disposition schedule for New York local government records, or LGS-1, is shown on the right. Once adopted, it becomes your policy for managing records. It sets the minimum amount of time you must retain a record and lets you know when you may dispose of it. State agencies, however, use the general retention and disposition schedule for New York state government records for records commonly created and maintained by agencies, including administrative, fiscal, and personnel records. The state general schedule is shown on the left. State agencies with unique records or records not covered by this schedule will need to request authorization for an agency-specific schedule from the state archives. New York City mayoral agencies work with the Department of Records and Information Services, or DORIS, as Maria mentioned, to develop retention schedules. Now, the purpose of a retention schedule is to ensure that records are retained as long as needed for administrative, legal, and fiscal purposes. It's also to ensure that state and federal record retention requirements are met, to ensure that records with enduring historical or other research value are identified and retained permanently, and to encourage and facilitate the systematic disposal of unneeded records.
So nowadays, I think everyone involved in government understands that records are not just on paper, although those are the ones you probably see the most, but they're also in a lot of electronic formats and a variety of electronic formats. So records in software systems, spreadsheets, PDFs, Word docs, email, just to name a few. We also copy them in various locations, both online and on media, like those pictured, although we may no longer use CDs and floppies and cassettes, but they may be hanging around in storage. So electronic records aren't as visible or need as much space as paper, but there are good reasons why they must be managed, why you wouldn't want to just keep them all. And some of these reasons relate to system performance. So if you got too many records stored in an electronic system, it affects performance by slowing down retrieval rates, just like too many paper records in your record storage room. You may have experienced slow retrieval rates or poor system performance with records in an email system or on a network. Another reason you don't want to save everything is higher migration costs. So periodically, electronic records need to be transferred to new electronic platforms. So for example, when you upgrade your software to a new version or you purchase new hardware for storage. Migration must be done to ensure that data can still be accessed and used even when technology changes. And this needs to be done before the media degrades. So if you save everything and you're migrating it from one platform to another, you're going to be spending money to migrate obsolete records. Maintaining obsolete records, especially sensitive records, can increase your liability and any risks associated with someone accessing those records when they could have been disposed of. So similar issues with paper records. If you have you also have a legal obligation to produce those records. So even if the record exists in electronic format, even if you consider the paper record the official record copy, and you destroy that on a regular basis. If you still have the electronic record, then you must produce it. So it's not like getting rid of the record at all. So ideally, you want to know what formats your records exist in and dispose of all formats on the same schedule. And if you don't label and manage records stored on media, again, like the media pictured, if you put that in storage without a label, it's not going to be long before you forget what's on it. So if you have to hire somebody to find out what's on it because you're concerned that it might be records, and then you determine that it's actually obsolete records or simply a backup, then you will have wasted time and money needlessly. Now, implementing retention may be something a lot of you may be trying to do to reinvigorate your records management program. We got to get a process in place for people to start retaining and disposing records in a systematic way. So these are some ways to help implement retention and familiarize people that you work with regular records disposal. So the idea that records lose value over time and not all records are permanent. So records disposal actually doesn't take a lot of time if you're prepared for it. But if you're not prepared, or you don't dispose of records regularly, people become unsure about what can go. And then they second guess themselves, and then they say, well, we'll just keep these records just in case. So remember, Karen and I have been talking about retention schedules and how they're developed, and the fact that you have to legally adopt them for your records management program. These give you a legal standing to dispose of obsolete records. And you want your program, as I mentioned, they're also built around the value of your records. So you should feel confident when you're using your retention schedule. But you'll feel confident only if you use the schedule. And the more you use the schedule and dispose of records on a regular basis, the whole disposition process will become a part of regular business. So again, some things you can do to implement retention is to record disposition dates on boxes, make it part of the label. So the destruction date or permanent in databases or on electronic files. You could also schedule annual dispositions. So the same time, maybe at least once a year, at a convenient time for everybody in your organization, maybe during a slow period, everybody gets together and they identify records that may need to be moved out of their office into storage. You provide them with procedures on what boxes to use, what labels to use, what information to put on the label. Everybody moves their records out of their office, and then at the same time, you go into the inactive records storage room and you identify records that have destruction dates and are eligible for destruction. That can make a nice, efficient and economical way to regularly dispose of records. Maybe at the same time, you can involve IT and you can address the electronic records as well. Another thing that you can do is create office retention schedules or office schedules, which I'm going to talk about in a moment and show you an example. These can help implement regular management of records. And the more records management is incorporated into regular business and documented with procedures, the less you'll need to train staff. Everybody will be prepared for it. They'll just look at their procedures for disposing of records on a regular basis and just go through the process. And it makes it a team effort as well. New staff, of course, will need training, but you could make records management training part of orientation. And that would be a good way to bring them on board right away. So everybody gets to get in on the act and have fun disposing of records. Okay, so this is an example of an office retention schedule. What's great about it is it's not the 100-page LGS1 or general schedule. It's a nice short list that focuses on the records that are created and maintained by a specific office. The least amount of information you want on it includes the record series, the retention period, and the matching item in your retention schedule. That shows legal compliance. It's a shorter list than your formal retention schedule, but it documents the retention schedule that you're using. So it shows that you're following that schedule. And if you needed to refer back to the longer schedule, you've got the number handy so you can easily refer back to it. On this particular example, we've got the record series name, information, a little more information about the records, so a description field, and then a retention period, and the matching item in the LGS1 schedule. But you could add more information. You could add a comment field that indicates any notes about longer retention. If you choose to keep a record a little longer than its minimum retention period, you could document that in your office retention schedule. You could also identify what formats the records exist in. Are they paper and electronic? So you can manage both of those at the same time. Because it's a nice short list with minimal information, it can help encourage others to manage their records using the office retention schedule. Under the Freedom of Information law, local governments all governments are required to be able to produce a subject matter list of the records that their office create and maintain should the public request one. Now, your formal schedule is your backup, but a retention schedule is a nice, short, succinct list that you could provide someone. In addition, if you didn't like the legal term for the record in the formal retention schedule, you could use a more common name on the list that you're creating for your office.
Another key program element is storage. Several factors require careful consideration for your record storage, and some of these include environmental stability, organization, and security. Environmentally stable and safe conditions are necessary for extending the life of paper and electronic records, for servers and media that stores records. For example, record storage areas should maintain temperatures between 65 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and relative humidity should be between 40 and 55%. There should be good air circulation, and sunlight should be minimized since it will contribute to an increase in temperature and ultraviolet light. A few safety considerations are noted as well, such as using safe ladders or step stools, secure shelving, and good lighting. Record storage must be well organized for efficient and cost-effective records retrieval. Using the right equipment is important, such as lateral filing cabinets or shelving for active records, 18-gauge steel shelving for inactive records, standard cubic foot triple corrugated cardboard boxes, clearly labeled, or using a tracking tool to monitor and manage your records. Examples of tracking tools may be a document management system, a spreadsheet, or even a database. And remember that a good paper filing system could be used as a model for labeling and organizing records stored in an electronic format. Record security is another important element. The slide has a list of security considerations for physical records, but hardware and media storing electronic records should also be kept secure, behind locked doors, accessed only by authorized personnel, as well as set up with firewalls and password protection, and scheduled for daily backups. In addition to security, both formats should be protected from disasters like flooding, fire, and man-made problems. Electronic records should be backed up and permanent electronic records protected with a remote archival backup of the records, indexing, and related software.
Okay, so access and creating easy access to records is another key records management activity. As far as paper records go, you should be able to find a paper record within minutes. And some things to enable this include keeping an updated, and that's updated inventory with records, locations, and information. That can help you quickly get to the exact shelf location where a box is stored. But you do have to keep that inventory updated. So every time you have that records disposal day, you update the information in the inventory where you placed new boxes or removed old ones. Consistent labels on boxes and files with information about things like the department that created the record series, the dates of the records that are either in the box or in the files, and the destroy date or permanent retention can also ensure quick access. Another thing that you might do is index certain records. And ideally, you would want to use an online index. This could be for things like your older minutes, maybe those that haven't been typed, that are handwritten. You could index vital records to determine which volume you need to find a particular record, or you could index personnel files or building permits so that you know exactly what box contains a specific personnel file or permit. Another thing that can be helpful is to digitize certain paper records. And I say certain because if you're going to spend money to reformat and also store digital records, then you want to choose only those that need it. So for example, records that need improved access or are used regularly or are needed by multiple people in multiple locations or are needed off-site. So one example may be, say, payroll registers. If you're using those regularly to fulfill retirement requests, and you've got to use them in paper format, and you've got to search every individual payroll record, say, to collect payroll information for the past 10 years, that can be a very time-consuming process if the records are in paper format and in individual registers. So that would be an example of a good paper record series that would be great to have digitized. You could also look for ways to maintain electronic records in their original format, so not printing them out to paper at all. You might work with your IT to determine if there are any born digital records whose software can maintain them for their full retention period, or determine if they could be migrated to another system at some point in order to maintain them for the remainder of their retention period. It's also important to organize and index electronic records. And you can do this by creating naming conventions for electronic records. So these are clear, logical names given to individual files that you create or receive. Names that can help you identify the record for access and know its retention period, and also know the date that it was created, so you know when it can be deleted or if you need to to take extra steps to preserve it. If you're storing records on a network drive, for example, or maybe even in your email software, you could create a system of folders and subfolders, kind of like the example on the slide, to help you identify the record for access and also know its retention period. You can also add indexing to electronic files and folders. So the example on the slide is a system of files and folders on a network. And as you can see, it's labeled with the department that created the record, the individual record series, and along with that record series, it also indicates its retention. It's a permanent record. And then within that folder, the minutes are organized by meeting date for easy access. If records are created electronically, or optical character recognition is added when you're scanning certain records, that will make them keyword searchable. And then you can also use your software's search engines to find the records. Something else you could do to manage your records with indexing capabilities is implement an electronic content management system. This is essentially an electronic repository for, as I mentioned before, a whole variety of electronic records, either scanned or born digital, and they can be migrated or scanned into this system and then managed with indexing in one central repository. So essentially, with a content management system, you could share the system with multiple or all departments in your organization, and that way all of your government's inactive records could be stored and managed in one central location. And if you were choosing index terms for setting up individual templates for records in your electronic content management system, you could use similar terminology as shown on the slide. So information about the creating department, the record series, the records dates, and the retention of the record. This slide just shows an example of how building or property files could be scanned and stored in an electronic content management system by parcel number. And I can't quite show you here, but inside each of those files would be records related to that specific parcel number, regardless of what department they came from. So these might be building permits, certificates of occupancy, maps, plans, and other records. And all of those records are indexed with information about the creating department, the record series, the dates, and their retention. And you could include other indexing information as well. The electronic content management system then uses the indexing to automate managing the records, including records disposal if necessary. So your records management program should be built around records retention and disposition. And part of the disposition process should involve monitoring permanent records and taking steps to ensure their permanency. So making records disposal, aka records destruction, a regular part of your records program is essential for getting people comfortable and familiar with not keeping everything forever, regularly disposing of records that have lost value over time. But you want to have a process for doing this. And it's important to have a process to authorize destruction and also to document records destruction. And the State Archives has a publication on how you can do that and also a form that you can use. We call it the Records Destruction Authorization Form that allows you to identify information about the records being disposed of. So it collects record series information, the dates of the records being disposed of, their retention period, and the matching item in your retention schedule. And then it gets approved by the department head of that created the records that are being disposed of, and also the records management officer. That form is retained for at least 6 years, and it becomes evidence to show that you are managing your records legally according to your adopted schedule. So nobody can say that you've just thrown out records without regard to their value. So you've got the retention and disposition schedule as your backup to show that you're legally disposing of those records, and a process in place to have evidence to show that you've done that. It's important to keep in mind that records are disposed of appropriately. So consider confidential records. Those should be destroyed completely. And if you don't want to spend a lot of time sorting through records to determine what may or may not be confidential, we recommend just disposing of all records by shredding, or if you had access to an incinerator, maybe by burning, or another reliable method that completely destroys all of the information. As far as electronic records go, I'm sure most people know that you can't just delete the record because it doesn't actually destroy the record completely. When you hit the delete button, it removes the path to the record, but the record still could be recovered on the hard drive. So you want to have a complete process, such as using overwriting software to wipe the information completely from the hard drive. Another way to do that is with degaussing. That's a system of applying magnetic waves to scramble the data on a hard drive. And if you're going to dispose of computer equipment or computer media or any sort of equipment with a hard drive, you want to have a process for physically destroying the hard drive so no data or information could be recovered. And there are a lot of recycling companies out there that recycle paper who are now doing computer equipment as well. So if you needed to dispose of hard drives, you might contact your paper recycling vendor or shredding vendor and see if they do computer media as well. Preservation of permanent and long-term records must also be a part of your program. So permanent records should be created on stable long-term media, and this ensures their permanency. For example, paper board meeting minutes should be printed on archival or acid-free paper. And if you're going to maintain them on paper, if you were going to maintain them in a digital format, you would want to maintain them on a PDF-A. That's a long-term open format and the archival version of a standard PDF. And that's an appropriate format for a multi-page document like your meeting minutes. A TIFF would be a good long-term format for photographs or single documents like maps and plans. Climate-controlled storage, as Karen mentioned, is necessary to ensure the permanence of both paper records and servers that are storing electronic records. Paper records at risk of information loss should have preservation backups made before any information is lost. So this is why you want monitoring to be a part of your annual records disposal or your annual disposal day or disposition day. Monitor your permanent records, dispose of your obsolete non-permanent records. Permanent and long-term electronic records must have a backup for disaster management purposes. As far as electronic records go, this is a requirement of the regulations of the Commissioner of Education for both for state agencies, local governments, and New York City mayoral agencies. So this isn't a daily backup, although you want to have those too for all of your government records as a disaster strategy. But this would be an unchanging archival backup of your permanent records that's stored remotely, so far enough away from your office so that the same disaster couldn't affect records in both locations. And the remote backup could be digital records, a digital backup, or it could be something like records, the permanent records copied onto microfilm. Permanent records in any format again, should be monitored regularly to prevent information loss. And permanent electronic records must have a migration plan to prevent that data loss. That's also a requirement under the regulations of the Commissioner of Education.
This slide lists basic steps in program development that must be maintained for good records management program to manage records throughout their life cycle. An important point to keep in mind on program development is that all the staff in an organization needs to participate in the various steps of records management in order to have an effective program. Now let's talk about some of these steps. One of the steps listed is records inventory. Conducting an inventory means all the records created or received by your organization need to be located, identified, and described. This includes active and inactive records, regardless of format, like paper, electronic, microfilm, or any other format. The form shown on this slide is called the Records Inventory Data Worksheet. And it's the worksheet you could use to inventory paper records, and it can also be used to collect data on electronic records. There is a separate form with instructions for electronic systems containing electronic records, and both of these forms are located on the Forms and Tools page in the Records Management section of the State Archives website. All the data collected in an inventory, plus feedback by staff using the records, can then be used to create a plan to manage your records. Conducting and then maintaining a records inventory can also help you in a number of ways. You can identify record series so you can apply their retention, know how long to keep the records, and when you can destroy them if they're not permanent. You can identify which records are permanent, so you can consider storage requirements for them and for preservation backups. You will know what records exist in multiple formats, so you can dispose of them on the same schedule. And you can determine the quantity of certain records generated annually for a series or all of them to help you plan for space needed. For reference, a publication is available on the State Archives website called Inventory and Planning: The First Steps in Records Management. Electronic records and systems are a common topic of discussion and source of questions. On this slide, we've listed types of electronic data to collect on electronic record systems. Again, further guidance is available on this data by referring to the electronic records inventory instructions and data field definitions found on the Forms and Tools page on the Archives website. All records management programs need to have a process for identifying and retaining and preserving archival records. What are archival records? Well, archival records are essentially records with historical value or other enduring value and are kept permanently because of their long-term research use. Maria also touched on records with historical value on an earlier slide. The process of determining which records are historical is accomplished by a records appraisal. The State Archives conducts certain appraisals and is also available to provide guidance on others. Records identified as archival are permanently retained, preserved, and made available to the public whenever possible. Local governments are responsible for preserving and making their historical records available. State agencies transfer their archival records to the state archives, and New York City mayoral agencies work with Doris to transfer their archival records to the municipal archives. Let's talk about another important step for your records management program. The inventory will help you assess records needs, and that information can be used to prepare a records management plan. The plan prioritizes your records management goals year by year, and it guides your program development. Remember, inventory is the beginning of program development, and formal or informal analysis of the results can then be used. For example, you can use hard data, like the quantity of inactive records, and also use soft data, like staff are having trouble with finding certain records. So each of this type of information can be used to help begin documenting beginning your program development. A records management plan includes short and long-term goals. A short-term goal could be defined as 1 year or possibly just in the near future. Long-term goals could be defined as 3 to 5 years. And ideally, you should develop a new plan every 3 to 5 years. Remember, though, goals are not set in stone. You may need to reassess the plan's goals if circumstances surrounding your program significantly change. An example could be funding that was no longer available for a project that was planned, or you experienced damage to records that were in inactive storage. When preparing the records management plan, it could be focused on one area, or it can be organization-wide. Small programs in particular should focus on the whole organization. And the records management plan should be designed in a way to ensure you are meeting your goals. You don't want to set unattainable goals. Having a records management plan is a tool to help keep your program development on track. This is simply an outline of a records management plan to address needs over 4 years, or all 4 years might focus on one of these depending on the complexity of the project and the resources available. An actual records management plan should contain more detailed information. So let's say for year 1 that the goal may be to set up a records center. Additional information that could be included for this step would be set up, improve, or revitalize a program for inactive record storage, an inventory of all records. Then develop policies and procedures for maintaining this program element. Year 2 of the plan could be use the inventory data to identify and digitize frequently used records. Then the next 2 years in the plan, years 3 and 4, could be to begin implementation of an ECMS to manage digital records, and then expand the use of the ECMS to other departments in the last year. And remember, this is just an example to help you develop or refine your plan.
Okay, I just wanted to quickly mention policies and procedures. We've got some examples on the slide. The policy is the general rule you want followed. The procedures are the detail. How do we do it? These should be developed for all program areas that we talked about today. So retention, storage, access, disposition, preservation of records in all formats. The reason you want to have policies and procedures is because they help build your program and ensure program permanence. They're helpful to remind you what needs to be done, so there's no second guessing, no winging it, no confusion, especially if you're only disposing of records annually. You want to have it written down. What did we do last year? We'll do it exactly the same way this year. They can also be a great tool to train new staff. They're great for succession planning. So anybody out there thinking of retirement, is there a better gift to give to the new RMO than policies and procedures for managing records? They also provide more evidence to defend your record keeping practices. And if you need a template for policies and procedures for the activities we talked about today, the State Archives has a template on our forms and tools page. It covers all sorts of records management activities, but also the ones we talked about today. So you could use the template to start with those. So in closing, stay connected with the State Archives. That is one of the recommended legal requirements for records management officers. Stay connected with us so you know records management best practices and you can share those with others in your organization. You can get some of that information by signing up for our newsletters. We've got free training and services available that we announce in the newsletters. We've got lots of resources on the State Archives website. And if you need any assistance with that, you can contact us at this email address, recmanagement@nyscd.gov or recmgmt@nyscd.gov. Thank you all for joining us today. If people want to stay, we can take questions. If were questions typed in the chat box, the questions and answers will be recorded too if you can't stay.
Yes, I was going to add, Maria, we may not get to everyone's questions. I tried to field some of the questions in replies to everyone in the group, some of the questions about the recording location, etc. But let me ask some of these, present some of these questions here to Maria and Karen. Let's see, we had a question from Allison early on. Would we be able to get a PDF copy of the schedule? The LGS one looks like, so we can use it as a template to create our own. And that was a couple of different people had asked that question.
Oh yes, absolutely. And I would use recmanagement@nyscd.gov. Let us know that's what you want, and we'll connect you with your records advisor or your state agency services advisor. And we can show you, not only is there a PDF, but there is a wonderful online tool built into the State Archives website that is the LGS1 schedule. And you can also cut and paste from that to create a nice office retention schedule.
Okay, let's see here. We have a question. I had some people from school systems asking about things, and I did email you Sarah Durling's contact information. She is our regional advisory officer for those folks. Here's a question from Nicole. Can you please clarify the retention of emails? She works in a school district.
Oh, Nicole, that is a very long question. Emails don't have an individual retention as a format per se, but there are retentions based dependent upon the record that the email contains. So we do have some resources that can provide you with further information and elaboration on that. And just to save time, I would recommend you contact Sarah Durling, who's your records advisor, and she can point you to those resources to help clarify. And if anybody else would like them, send us an email at recmanagement and we'll send them to you as well.
Caitlin asks, when transferring records from a paper format to digital, should the paper copies be retained?
Again, another well, it's dependent on a lot of things, and we do have specific guidance on the website and also a response to that. There are a number of things that you need to consider because there are legal requirements for reformatting government records. A big one is to make sure if you're replacing the paper that all of the paper records have been scanned and they're all readable. So there's a whole requirement to verify what's been scanned to ensure that you've got a one-to-one replacement when you're moving on to digital. All the digital formats are the appropriate formats, and then you've got all the technology in place to back up those records, create that remote archival backup and things like that. So again, contact your advisor so you can have those requirements in paper and you can read through them and make sure you've considered everything before you dispose of the paper records.
Marianne asks, she says here, our town has been printing out town board meeting minutes and storing them in minute books in our vault. Can these be only maintained on Laserfiche, and do we need permission to do this?
That kind of is part of the scanning records and maintaining the scanning records and disposing of the paper guidance that we provide. So again, I would email us at Rec Management and we'll send you some detailed information that you can review. Make sure, again, you've considered all of the legal requirements required for reproducing the records in electronic format. And make sure you've considered everything, again, before you switch over from from paper to electronic, especially, I mean, as far as digitizing the records go.
Okay, Jennifer says here she's with the fire district. Are there any resources, best practices, and training available / plan for police departments considering potential impacts of clean slate and discussions about evolving county level record management initiatives?
Well, that's a huge question. I would have a discussion with your records advisor on that because it's very specific, and I'm not exactly sure what exactly the questions are. It sounds like more of a discussion than a specific question that you want answered.
Okay, let's see, just kind of scrolling through here to see if we have any other questions at this point. And I don't see any other questions, and we're about 10 minutes over. So again, I just want to remind folks, I did paste in again the email to ask us questions, which is recmgmt@niced.gov. And we'll get to your question and we'll get it to the right place if we haven't answered it here or if we need to send you a more involved reply. So having said that, looks like maybe we should just could wrap up for the session, Maria.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today, and don't forget we'll send you the recording if you weren't able to stay for the whole presentation, or if you want to listen to it again. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.